Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening. I know folks are filtering in, but we're going to go ahead and get started. So, my name is Emma Woods, and I am the co-chair of YPFP's Latin America discussion group and an advisor with Pan American Strategic Advisors. I will be moderating tonight's panel with my co-chair Rob, where we'll discuss the Trump Corollary and the future of Venezuela. We will spend the first hour on an in-depth conversation, and we've reserved the last 20 to 30 minutes for an audience Q&A. You can find the Q&A button on the bottom right hand of your screen. Feel free to ask questions throughout. Now, please allow me to introduce our speakers and experts. Adam Ratzlaff is the founder and CEO of Pan American Strategic Advisors and a member of Diplomatic Courier's World in 2050 Brain Trust. He has been studying and working on inter-American affairs for over 15 years and has consulted for the World Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, and the State Department. He holds a bachelor's from Tulane University in International Relations, Economics, and Latin American Studies, a master's in International Relations from the University of Denver, and is an International Relations PhD candidate at Florida International University. Gil Guerra is an immigration policy analyst at the Nice Cannon Center, a contributing writer at The Dispatch, the vice president of publications for YPFP, and in 2024 was named YPFP's rising expert in Latin America. His work focuses on immigration and foreign policy, the demographics of irregular migration, and assimilation processes. He holds a bachelor's in political science from Swarthmore College and a master's in global security and borders from Queen's University, Belfast. Maria Isabel Puerta Riera is a Venezuelan political scientist and university professor who has taught numerous courses on international politics, U.S. government, both local and state, sociology, governance, and democracy. She has authored 2 books, multiple book chapters, and published papers specializing in democratic theory, political systems, and political culture. She holds a bachelor's in political science and government from Universidad Fermín Toro, a master's in political science and public administration from Universidad de Carabobo, and a doctorate in social sciences from Universidad de Carabobo. And last but certainly not least, we have Raul Sanchez Urribarri. He is a Venezuelan political scientist and an associate dean and associate professor at Trobe University in Melbourne, Australia. He specializes in social sciences, crime, justice, and legal studies. His research focuses on constitutionalism, judicial politics, rule of law, and the decline of democracy in Venezuela. He holds a Bachelor of Law from Universidad Católica Andrés Bello, a Master of Law from University of Cambridge, and a PhD in political science from the University of South Carolina. Thank you all for being here this evening. Now I will pass it to Rob to give an overview of the current situation in Venezuela and where we are today.
Thanks, Emma. Before I start, I should say that I've been asked to say that nothing that I or any of the panelists or moderators say tonight reflect the position of my employer, and I speak only for myself. After more than 2 decades of rule by Hugo Chavez and his successor, Nicolás Maduro, Venezuela stands at a dramatic inflection point. On January 3rd, 2026, U.S. military forces launched strikes against Venezuelan government targets and captured President Maduro and his wife, flying them to New York to face federal drug trafficking and related criminal charges, an extraordinary action that has sparked intense global debate over legality and sovereignty. In Caracas, former Vice President Delcy Rodriguez has assumed the interim presidency. Rodriguez, long a prominent Chavista and close ally of Maduro, is navigating efforts to consolidate power while balancing a message for a domestic audience of asserting Venezuelan sovereignty and rejecting perceived U.S. orders, all without sacrificing her status as the U.S. government's preferred option. The Chavista movement first rose to prominence after Hugo Chavez, a former military officer, won the presidency in 1998 and established a highly personalized, oil-funded political model that flourished under high oil prices. His successor, Maduro, presided over a steep economic decline marked by chronic shortages of food and medicine, leading to declining support, which he managed with increasing repression. Outside observers widely agree that, contrary to government claims, Maduro lost the 2024 election by a significant margin. Moving forward, the challenges facing Venezuela are enormous. An uncertain investment climate and armed criminal actors deter many investors from a country estimated by whom Venezuela to have a poverty rate over 75%. The refugee organization R4V estimated in November 2025 that there were 6.9 million Venezuelan refugees and migrants in Latin America and the Caribbean, with another 1.5 million more in the US and Spain. A future democratic transition must also overcome divisions among the opposition, which are larger than many outsiders realize. And a revolving door of repression continues to curtail free speech in the country as new political prisoners replace those freed by the government from the nation's jails. As of January 19th, the non-governmental organization Foro Penal counted 777 political prisoners who remained in detention. As of today, Venezuela is very much in flux. And with that, we would like to jump into some lightning round questions for our presenters. These will be short answers, and I'll offer the first question here. Have the events of January 3rd moved us closer or further away from restoring democratic rule to Venezuela?
I'll go ahead and answer first before handing it over. First off, thank you everyone for being here. Rob, Emma, thank you guys so much for hosting this. I would argue that it's closer, but only if U.S. attention remains or there is a necessary increase in multilateral pressure on the country.
I'm going to jump ahead, and this is because this is the order of my own Zoom screen. First of all, thank you so much again for the opportunity. This is fantastic. I think the short answer, the short pop quiz answer is we don't know. And we need to sit with that uncomfortable fact. The reality is we don't know. We don't even have a high degree of certainty. But in terms of scenarios, there are possibilities now that didn't exist prior to the events of January the 3rd. And within that realm of possibility, there is a likelihood, again, very hard to measure, that there might be, down the road, a transition to democracy. But it won't be tomorrow, and it won't be next week, and you see where I'm going.
I'll jump in. Thank you, Emma, Adam, Robert. I appreciate you organizing this and giving me the opportunity to share my thoughts with you. And I do agree with Raul that we really don't know. A first step, of course, is having Nicolás Maduro out of the picture. But what's concerning is that who's in charge is basically the same. I think it is or was an ally. And given the circumstances of the removal of Maduro, that brings into question how interested she was in his departure, right? So that should give us probably more material, not just to speculate, but also to create, draw some scenarios where this was not accidental. And probably this was what some reporting has advanced or brought to the discussion that this was something that was in the making for not months, probably a year or so. And it was just the moment that both maybe the Trump administration and the Rodriguez coalition thought it was necessary to remove Maduro, because probably he was an obstacle for both. So I think this is a lot more complex, and I don't think we are near the conclusion. It's probably the end of the Maduro or Madurismo era, but it's probably the beginning of another cycle that's not necessarily associated with democracy or a transition to democracy.
Great. Well, I'll just echo everyone else's thanks. Thanks to all the staff, and also thanks to Real Maria. I followed your work on this topic, so I'm very excited to get a chance to speak with both of you. We were asked to keep this to 10 words, so I will say close but still very far, and you can add however many varies you want. That will get me to 10.
Great. Thank you all. My follow-up to that would be, what does this mean for US prospects in Latin America? Do we think they've improved because of these actions? Adam, we can go in the same order. Adam, if you want to start.
Sure. So to keep it very quick and brief, I'd say in the short term, yes, this makes the United States look better. Long term, this is a resounding no from me.
Raul?
Exactly. Next on the screen. And I agree with Adam. There are different ways of answering this question. One is us as analysts, then looking at the data, what people feel on the ground, how political elites might feel towards it. And of course, there is a general, I think, historical, political, geopolitical conversation to be had too. From a historical geopolitical conversation, the answer is quite worrying. It's a no. From a more fine-grained conversation regarding where we sit right now, well, there are different reactions here at the elite level and on the ground too. So on the ground, there seems to be, from the surveys that we've seen, quite a bit of support in several countries to this adventure, for lack of a better term. And on the other hand, from the point of view of the elites, there is diversity too. It signals, in the end, a different attitude from the Trump administration forward slash the US to the rest of the region, one that's different from the last 3 decades of engagement with the region as well. Not all elite actors in the region, political, economic, and so forth, will be unhappy with that turn, depending on not only ideological allegiances but also business, political interests, and you name it. So it is a very interesting, complicated story, I think.
Thank you. Maria?
Um, so I think this is like the very aggressive response to the lack of presence of the US in Latin America. And from not even engaging in not just a conversation, but not that there wasn't support for negotiations between the opposition and Chavismo, Madurismo. I'm talking about engagement with democratic aspirations in Venezuela. We went from not having anything to do with that to basically, with today's news, that there is some sort of plan to send some military presence in Venezuela. We went from not engaging to basically taking over. So I don't know if this was what some were expecting to be more engagement, but it doesn't look like it.
In the short term, yes. In the medium and longer term, it's harder to say. I think that there is a historical precedent of the US making mistakes based on hubris in foreign policy in Latin America. If 1954, after Operation PB Success removed Guatemalan President Jacobo Arbenz, you could very easily say US prospects in the region were much better. Obviously, the template that that sets led to the mistaken US belief that regime change in other countries would be just as easy, which then led to the Bay of Pigs operation. And we can all very easily tell, obviously, how that one turned out. So I think that there's a real risk that we are running, perhaps, of saying that Operation Absolute Resolve could be replicated in countries such as Cuba or perhaps Colombia in ways that would be very dangerous and very harmful for US interests.
Thanks, Gil. I like that a lot. Next question. I'll ask you to give a yes or no answer to this, and then I'll explain. Should other states in the region be worried? And I'll ask for a yes or no answer to that, and then which countries, if you answer yes. Adam, if you can start us.
Yes, but it will look very different than what we just saw. And I think that you could say that for almost every country in the region, but with a particular emphasis on Panama, Colombia, Cuba, Nicaragua, and Mexico are all places that I could see U.S. military or at least pressure being applied in different ways.
I'm gonna piggyback on Adam's answer, and I agree with you, Adam. I think that's a very good map so far. And I would add, to the conversation, other Caribbean countries, which are not technically part of Latin America as such, but they are part of the Caribbean sphere, and that there is a Caribbean conversation to be had here too.
Um, I I think yes, but I see different reasons for that concern. For example, if the U.S. Um, embraces this policy of engagement with any country, not just in Latin America, but any country, of course, everybody should be extremely worried, especially Cuba, Nicaragua, and any other. But also, I would say countries like Colombia or Brazil should be very worried due to the consequences of this policy in countries like Venezuela, for example, the spillover effect, and so on. So I would say there are different ways we can look at the consequences or the impact this policy could have in the region.
I would echo the ones that have been selected, but I'll throw a fun country in the mix, so to speak. I think El Salvador should be worried. I think that this precedent, now that it's been set, for example, if you are a Democratic president in, say, 2028 or 2032, you view Bukele as a dictator who has potentially collaborated with drug leaders in his own country. You now have this sense that we can pull off operations like this. El Salvador is a much smaller country. Henry Zeimer has a great piece out about Venezuela's air defenses and comparing them specifically to other ones in the region. El Salvador's air defenses, for example, are far less developed. If I were Bukele, I might be thinking, what would an especially vengeful or wrathful Democratic administration, now this precedent has been set, want to do in 2028, 2032? Obviously, unlikely, but I think certainly not outside of the realm of possibility.
Thank you. I'm glad you mentioned that because I think that is something a lot of us haven't thought about, what it looks like in 2028. But as we know, decisions like this have short-term impacts, but can change a lot in the long term, especially as our administrations flip and how polarizing it's been. So thank you for mentioning that one. And to wrap up the lightning round, what would you say the most significant unintended consequences of the actions of January 3rd are? Limit it to no more than three. And if you are able to rank them in order, that would be great as well.
So I'm assuming this means from the Trump administration in particular, since they're the ones who took the action. And I think there's two big ones in my mind that they haven't considered fully. The first is I think they legitimately thought that the oil companies were going to jump into Venezuela immediately. The second one, I don't think they thought through what this looks like for immigration in the long and medium term. I think they had this thought that this would open the door to deportation flights and haven't thought beyond that.
Those are two very good points. And in my case, I'm thinking Venezuela, government and opposition logics, because it's not linear, and it's very hard to know at this stage how a consolidated, stable equilibrium in Venezuela will look like in the mid to long run, even as of now.
My first one is Delcy Rodriguez as the leader that President Trump trusts to either stabilize or whatever the plan is. I don't think that's clear, but I think that's one first item that we need to consider. It doesn't matter really the context. It's just trust in a leader. And the other is how regime change looks now after we spent a great amount of time talking about or debating if it was regime change or not. Is this regime change?
I would say that President Trump has a mixed record when it comes to influencing the elections of countries that are in the hemisphere. You can think of, for example, the legislative elections in Argentina, where he was successful in boosting Milei's party. But you could also think of the elections in Canada, where the conservative candidate was poised to win in almost every poll, and Mark Carney, the current prime minister, had a shocking comeback. There are two known elections in the region, or at least in South America, that kind of matter for Venezuela policy in the immediate term. Colombia has an election in May, and Brazil has an election in October. If the situation in Venezuela deteriorates such that the right-wing candidates in either country are harmed, then you could see another round for another administration of left-wing candidates in Colombia and Brazil, sort of bucking the more right-leaning trends, to say nothing of perhaps a potential election in Venezuela. I don't know that we'll get one this year, but if Maria Corina Machado is so undermined by the comments Trump has made, by the obvious kind of disrespectful gestures he has made towards her, if that has actually delegitimized her, I'm sure we'll talk more about the opposition. Obviously, Raul and Maria know more about the internal dynamics certainly than I do, but I think that's another case of perhaps unintendedly undermining someone who has tried very hard to be an ally to this administration.
Thank you.
Yeah, wonderful comments. We want to move to the next set of questions here and kind of talk about some background for this event. And I'll start off by asking our panelists. Maduro had been in power since 2013 and Hugo Chavez for 14 years before that. How did they consolidate and maintain power?
So thanks, Rob. I think that's a really great question. And rather than trying to tackle all of the different ways, because I think each person on the panel will have a different approach to it, I think what I would focus on is how the Maduro regime took advantage of the international system. We're talking with YPFP here, so I wanted to kind of focus on the geopolitics of this a little bit. Um, and I think that there's two ways to look at this. One is Venezuela as part of the pink tide, and Chavez in particular, was particularly an irritant to the United States in a lot of ways, right? He was very vocally anti-imperialist. He led the pink tide in a lot of ways, and he cozied up to extra hemispheric powers, which we'll get into a little bit later, I'm sure, with some of the conversations on what the Trump corollary means. But he very much opened the door and kind of allowed a foothold for Russia, Iran, and China to enter the region. Notably, Venezuela was actually the largest recipient of Chinese intergovernmental loans from their policy banks. According to the Inter-American Development Bank's China Latin America Finance Database, they received about $59.2 billion in loans from China, which is about 49% of the total loans that China gave out. Now those loans aren't, still just like floating out there. Some of that's been paid off. China has stopped giving policy bank loans to Venezuela since 2015, but it's still one of those footprints that the United States has been deeply concerned about and created some of the environment that we see today that allowed both Chavez and Maduro to consolidate power in their time. The other side that I think is really important to look at the foreign policy side is the how Chavez and Maduro, more so once again with Chavez being kind of the architect of this, leveraged the regional dynamics. So in the 1990s, all the way through 2001, 2002, there was a very strong push at the international level and within the Americas to create mechanisms to prevent dictators from coming to power. There was the development of the Inter-American Democratic Charter. There was the Washington Declaration to create mechanisms for the region to respond and prevent militaries from taking power specifically, but also from self-coups from happening. And Chavez, in many ways, was able to break some of those things down. One, even in those debates, was debating what was the definition of democracy early on, raising questions about whether or not representative democracy was the correct form for countries to be looking at. But he also, at the same time, undermined the very international organizations that were in this that made up the system. So when we talk about the Inter-American system, we often talk about the Organization of American States, maybe the Inter-American Development Bank. But our team at PASA has been looking, and there are almost 50 regional organizations, and several of them were created by Chavez and during that pink tide period that helped undermine some of the credibility of those other organizations. Namely, he created the ALBA, the Bolivarian Alternative for the Americas. They changed names a few times, so I'm going to go with alternative for right now. He helped with the creation of CELAC, or the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, to serve as a counterbalance to the Organization of American States, which was viewed as a US-dominated organization, which also, once again, had that component about protecting democracy core to their mission. And he helped in this is kind of, we talked about the elections in Brazil with Lula, who's still there, the development of UNASUR, the Union of South American States. And that is an important component because later on, UNASUR holds electoral accompaniment missions to verify the elections in Venezuela, even when there is questions about the legitimacy of those elections happening. At the same time, Chavez and Maduro were able to lean into kind of regional dynamics by creating Petrocaribe, providing oil to the Caribbean, and building up support within those regional institutions to prevent them from being removed or having votes that were cast against them to invoke the Inter-American Democratic Charter throughout much of this period. Also, having all of these, and I wrote a report on this for Global Americans a couple years back, they're able to forum shop, right? Whenever there was a debate about, hey, we're going to condemn Venezuela, well, we don't trust the OAS to have this debate. Let's have it at CELAC. It starts to shift the focus on too much towards one side. We'll go to another organization. And other actors within the region would continue to do the same thing and create further problems for the negotiations to continue by going to another forum. One example I would point to is even the creation of the Lima Group in 2017, right, to create a forum to negotiate a solution for Venezuela. It was intentionally designed to exclude certain actors and make sure that it was only the actors that wanted a solution in Venezuela. And that created its own set of problems moving forward. We also saw some fracturing within the international system, within the inter-American system as it related to the emergence of Juan Guaido in 2019. Some organizations recognized him and shifted recognition to the interim government. Others didn't. And that also created this dynamic where different actors would look to different forum for where they could push that forward. And all of that helps to minimize the international pressure that the regime could have faced earlier on.
Thank you, Adam. I think that background is really helpful and leads us into the next question. And Maria and Raul, I'd be very interested to hear your responses to this. So under the Chavistas and thinking about the political culture and atmosphere that they created within their own country and the region, as Adam explains, what kind of foreign policy did they promote within the region, but also the hemisphere, keeping in mind engagement with the US and Canada? And how was this interplay with more global politics? Was their approach within the region and hemisphere consistent with how they engage with external actors? I know we just mentioned China, Russia, Iran. Where did it differ? But what did that look like under the Chavistas?
Maria, would you like to go first? ¿Quieres ir primero?
I would just add to Adam's background was excellent. I wouldn't add anything because the oil diplomacy was really what made Chavez a leader of that pink tide. Because when the oil prices started to drop, that's when you saw that, and it was right before he died, by the way. It wasn't that early. He had some hiccups during the recall. He had problems, but then the prices recovered. So he had a ton of resources to buy favors and to create that atmosphere of loyalty through oil diplomacy. But then Maduro had it really hard because he came at a time when the funds were not there. The Chinese were very disencouraged by the corruption of the Chavez years. So they had to resort, they needed other strategies, and they were mostly establishing connections to authoritarian governments exclusively, which Chavez did a lot, but Maduro had to use those connections, not just to make up for the lack of funds to attract and buy loyalty, but because he was already starting to feel the isolation after the sanctions. So Iran, it wasn't just Cuba and Nicaragua. Iran, Turkey, they started to strengthen those relationships, including Russia, with and I don't know, Raul, you should have more details. Even with some other countries that were not really about the resources, but it was just about support. And in international fora, that's really important. It doesn't matter if you're going to get something out of it, but at least to prevent accountability and, withdrawing from the OAS and the Inter-American human rights system, that was important to avoid accountability. So I guess that I would add that to what Adam just said. Raul.
Thank you so much, Maria, and thank you, Adam and Maria Isabel, because what we're having is a really interesting multi-casual exploration and conversation happening about how the change of foreign policy in Venezuela happened over the course of time and what effects took place. And Adam distinguished very, very well from the get-go, and I think this is very important, the sort of the global structural changes happening in the last 3 decades, which we need to be mindful of. And from Venezuela was an enthusiastic not only participant but motivator and leader of some of those changes in a hemispheric, regional sense, and even globally, even becoming an actor that changed also global alliances over the course of time and serve as a model not only for sister countries in the region, but also for other countries in the global south. Chavez's Venezuela, and this continued to some degree under Maduro, was an aspirational regime, positioning itself also like a middle power, almost like a middle power. It was fascinating to see, particularly in the first few years. And then, as Maria says, with the luck of the oil resources dwindling, then we start seeing a different story. So there is that kind of global structure story. One story that Maria is pointing to that I want to highlight is there is also 100% breakage between the Chavista / Maduro regime and some traits of foreign policy in Venezuela in the past. And I think this is very important to point out. Venezuela is an oil power. That means that it has a particular connection with and has developed a particular connection with other countries over the course of history, distinct from other nations in the region. Particularly with Middle Eastern countries, but even beyond. And I think that's an important point to consider as well, because it gives a particular gaze and expertise experience to the diplomatic corps. It develops relationships over the course of time and so forth. It's a part of the story that I feel has been somewhat neglected, but gives a bit of a historical institutional explanation to some of the patterns that we start seeing subsequently, particularly with the role of PDVSA and, of course, of petrodiplomacy, OPEC, and so forth as a forum. But third, of course, agency. This is what the Chavista regime and subsequently the Maderista regime wanted as part of a process of political change within the regime. And here there is an interplay between global changes happening and the death of 1,000 cuts of the idea of liberal democracy as a universal paradigm happening over the course of 3 decades, and also Venezuela as a pivotal story within that broader decline of democracy and rise of autocracy over the course of time, the quote-unquote multipolar world. And Venezuela is a big part of that story. Within Venezuela, we were speaking about changes. Foreign policy also forms part of that. The changes in foreign policy in different degrees also forms part of that death of 1,000 cuts, putting then foreign policy not only at the service of the country as a whole or the national interest, but at the services of the regime. There is a big part of the alliances that is explained by military cooperation, intelligence cooperation, and so forth, that changes because it is critical for the survival and the consolidation of the regime. Very briefly, in a book that we recently published a few months ago, edited by John Paul Gasimovich and I, with Maria's own vital participation with a chapter on the Venezuelan U.S. diaspora, we actually mapped one of the things that we noticed from the get-go of the project was, here the story is as domestic as it is international. And in fact, when you look at the book, that's how it's divided. Because and the interplay between the two became apparent right away from the beginning of the project, and it was actually one of the goals that we had with the book in question. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. Next question I would direct particularly to Maria and to Gil. What kind of role has the opposition played under Chavismo, both within and outside Venezuela? And maybe Maria, you could start us off.
Okay, I thought Gil was going. Well, I think we've had from the beginning a very complex opposition structure. Not all political parties have been on the same page in terms of the strategy to politically and electorally challenge first Chavez, and the Chavez of the first years after the Constitution was replaced by the 1999 Constitution. That was one type of opposition with a mix of divided parties, the old parties that mutated to new parties. But then after that period came the those old parties trying to survive with the young new parties that had different ideas. And at the end, those different ideas were not enough to sort of embrace a strategy that was helpful, especially after the 2004 recall. It really broke the expectation of fighting politically with an electoral through electoral means. That's when you started to have boycotting the election in 2005 was the first one that I remember. Raul, I don't know, you correct me if I'm wrong. But that sort of contradictions within the opposition, that helped Chavez at some point because he would paint the opposition as dysfunctional. After the 2002 coup, it was almost an equivalence opposition coup plotters. And it really diminished the opportunity to maybe fight politically and increasingly authoritarian perspective of we're not going to deal with the opposition because they are coup plotters and they don't believe in democracy. And Chavez basically co-opted the notion, the concept of democracy as something that only Chavismo would protect because the opposition was not serious enough. So I think that has been, I mean, I'm being very, I'm just touching the surface. It's a lot more complex. The opposition is very, let's think about islands. We have many, many different views, not ideological exclusively, but it's mostly about the strategy. The perspective from each political party and the coalitions that have been built from the Coordinadora Democrática all the way up to the current platform. I participated in that Coordinadora Democrática around 2000, between 2002 2004, and I don't know if it's any different from what I see now, which is basically a fragmentation of the parties and a complete dysfunction of strategies. So I guess I would start there, and Raul, Gil can pick it up from there.
Great. I'll talk about this in more of a structural way. One, I'll also talk about this more from the perspective of migration, since that is the field that I focus in and have expertise in, and I'll also tie this back to the fundamental question of this set of questions, which is how did we get here? And for me, I think that one of the really striking things to take away from this episode in history is that it's very clear to me that Venezuela underwent authoritarian learning from Cuba and really learned how Cuba managed its diaspora and its immigration policies. Because I think that if you're looking at this from the outside, you could very well say, how would it benefit Venezuela to have 7 million people leave the country? How would it benefit the Maduro regime to have all those people leave and, spread images of Venezuela as being impoverished and sort of a pariah state throughout? And, the answer is basically, I think what they learned from the Cuban example is that it's much easier to manage an opposition that is abroad than one that is at home. It's better to have a viper out in the bushes than in your bosom, so to speak. And, the reason for that is that when the opposition is abroad, one, there are less people that can mobilize for protests. Two, there are less people who can actually run for elections. The people who are abroad are ultimately going to be the ones who are also the most dissatisfied with the state of the country. While they're abroad, you can also paint them as being out of touch. You can say, okay, that person, one, ran away, but also two, they haven't been to Venezuela in 10, 15, 20 years in some cases. They don't actually know anything about what's on the ground. They've become sort of inundated by what they see on social media. They've come to be in the pockets of Western imperialist paymasters, etc. I think what they really learned from examples in places like Cuba is that you can actually discredit the opposition in a much easier way if they are abroad, and it also helps you internally for a number of reasons. You can say the United States, other democracies are painting us as a dictatorship, as this repressive regime, and hey, if we're so repressive, why are we letting people go if they want to go? If we are actually the dictators who say that we are, how come we are letting people go? One, and two, how come if you feel so bad about them, when they show up at your doorstep, why are you turning them away? Why are you putting them in detention camps in the United States when they're applying for asylum? If you actually think that they're being persecuted, why don't you take these people who are opposition figures, who you think are being politically persecuted here in Venezuela? So it's also become a way to discredit uh, governments like the United States who criticize the human rights violations in Venezuela. And the last part that I'll mention is that this is especially important perhaps for countries like Nicaragua, but certainly it's been important for Venezuela as well. When you have people who are abroad who are working in places like the United States, but also in places, say, like Colombia, Peru, Chile, any number of countries in the region, Spain outside of the region, they're also sending remittances back home, which for you is sort of a lifeline because I think that while I don't necessarily fully agree with this kind of either mode of thinking or theory of change, one of the ways in which the United States has thought about spurring protests or spurring revolutions perhaps in Latin America is that the populations get so fed up with the poverty, with the crime, with the corruption, with the repression, that they wind up taking matters into their own hands. This is what we believe, I think, will happen in Cuba if we actually cut them off hard enough. Maybe we'll talk about that a bit later. But in any case, the remittances that people send when they're actually working abroad are sort of a lifeline for these governments because if people are still subsisting in these what are effectively welfare states, the state does not actually have to subsidize them as much. The state can, rely on the fact that people are sending money in and getting by in that way without actually having to worry too much about things like economic growth or sanctions U.S. places on it. So that's a sort of a roundabout way of more from a grassroots level, perhaps, of how the regime has managed to stave off perhaps new opposition figures from rising, while Maria touched on the opposition as it was at the time.
Thank you. Gil, actually, this next one's going to be for you as well. So we know that nearly 8 million Venezuelans have left their country since the Chavistas took power, and most of this was during Maduro's rule. How has this impacted the region and the hemisphere as a whole? And when thinking about this impact, how does that play into what we're going to see in the aftermath of the events of January 3rd?
Yeah, I'll tell a story. I was in Colombia for a few weeks in January of last year, just as the administration was turning over. I was meeting with a number of different government officials in Colombia, both from the current administration and the previous Duque administration, both at the elected level and also people who were just government bureaucrats working in migration. I also got to meet a number of Colombians, just regular Colombians on the street. Obviously, if you're taking Ubers or taxis, you get to talk with your drivers. I had a taxi driver who, told me in very explicit terms that the Venezuelans in the United States were just there to deal drugs. They weren't coming the right way. Like people like him, for example. And I said, "Oh, you were in the United States. What did you do?" And he said, "Well, I was there for a few years. Unfortunately, I had a problem where I was in prison. And then I had to be, I got deported to back to Colombia, and I was like, "Oh, what were you in prison for?" And he says, "Well, I was, trafficking a little bit of heroin." So, at that point, it's gotten to the point where I think even the cognitive dissonance, for example, of people in the publics in places, say like Colombia, on the one hand, are reacting a little bit like this. I think that there is a real sense over time, especially the more prolonged the crisis has become, that it's sort of one, enough is enough, perhaps less charitably. You see this in a number of public polls that have been conducted throughout the region. There are negative stereotypes about Venezuelans. There are different views, perhaps, of Venezuelans that has helped to shift, I think, to some degree at least, some of the recent trends towards the right in elections can be, on the one hand, seen as being a response to what these countries have seen, either directly from the example of what they think Venezuela is like, or perhaps also from the migrants that they see in their countries and associations that they might have with Venezuelan migrants and crime. Obviously, it's more complicated than that. One way it's more complicated than that is that the Venezuelan voters who go to these countries are typically also more to the right, perhaps, than the median voters in these countries. You can think, for example, of the strong support that even here in the United States, President Trump had among many Venezuelan Americans in places like Florida. I think it's a bit more complicated than that. But I do think that one thing that we have seen that I think will be an enduring result of this is I think that the old models of Castro-Chavismo, if you want to call it that, have been fairly discredited to a large degree. I think a lot of people have seen how Cuba turned out, have seen how Venezuela turned out, and have decided that these models are not ones that are going to work in the region. That does not mean that the left, by any means, is electorally or politically defeated or vanquished in the region. But I do think that if you think about the leaders who have had success in the region, who are sort of the new wave, there are people like Boric, for example, who had a far more nuanced stance towards Venezuela and represented sort of a different new generation left that was not quite as tied, or at least not in the mold of, say, previous figures. And I think that people's interaction with Venezuelans, one way or another, either hearing their stories or perhaps forming stereotypes about them, have obviously played a very big role in that.
Thank you. And what a story. I don't think I've had that experience, but no, I think that was a great example and I appreciate the anecdote. We're gonna switch gears now into looking at this from the US side of things. Particularly, we're kind of, gonna look back at high school history when we're thinking about the Monroe Doctrine. That wasn't something that was spoken about in terms of modern policy when I was in school, even in university. It was definitely seen as a thing of the past. There was a resurgence a little bit during the first Trump administration. And then I think we've seen with the Trump Corollary, or as it pains me to say, the Don Roe Doctrine, it is very much brought back to life and very present. So, how does Venezuela fit into this policy and the hemisphere more broadly, thinking about the Trump Corollary, this new revived Monroe Doctrine? What are we looking at going forward? This is also going to be a nod back to the short and long term consequences of the actions of January 3rd. Adam, I'll go to you on this one.
Thank you, Emma. So yeah, the Monroe Doctrine is complicated, right? Because it's 200 years old and has been interpreted and reinterpreted over and over and over again to mean different things under different administrations. And what I'm going to, for those of us who don't focus on Latin America, like one thing to really look at is the Monroe Doctrine, when originally stated, wasn't enforceable. The United States was basically saying the Americas for the Americans, with a question mark around, first off, who were the Americans, right? So this was during the independence movements of Latin America, and it was actually embraced by a lot of Latin American leaders at the time. And then it became used as an excuse for doing anything we wanted to in the region for the next 200 years. In 2013, Kerry said it was dead, right? He was Secretary of State at the time. He went in front of the OAS General Assembly and said, nope, we're done. We're done with this. It's dead. We're going to see past this. But at the same time, then they started mentioning, you'd see Southcom, for instance, starting to bring up mentions of China as a threat in the region, and they need to push them out around the same time period. And that's that same idea of keeping extra hemispheric powers out of the Americas, even if not using the language of the Monroe Doctrine. And I think one area where it's interesting to say that we've actually heard a lot of this from both parties is the need for Monroe Doctrine 2.0 and what that looks like. And we've heard that for the last, I'd say, 10 years or so, really starting under the latter part of Obama. And some of that was through the language also saying we need a new good neighbor policy, which I'm much more in favor of that style of language around it. But when the good neighbor policy was initiated, at the time, it was a reinterpretation of the Monroe Doctrine such that we would treat others how we wanted to be treated. Or as they called it in foreign affairs at the time, um, it's the Monroe Doctrine plus the Golden Rule. Um, so I think it's interesting to see where that has shifted now, particularly as both Democrats and Republicans have sought to push China out of the region in particular. Um, the Americas Cressy Initiative under Trump won, APEP, a lot of this is about creating um, interregional collaboration. But we've seen Trump 2.0 really embrace not just the Monroe Doctrine, but the what was called the Roosevelt Corollary, which was the idea that Teddy Roosevelt had that you could just walk around and tell countries that were quote unquote misbehaving to behave and send a gunboat to them to make them behave. I think that that's much more what we're seeing. It's why I like the term the Trump corollary a lot more than referring clear back to the Monroe Doctrine, right? Like this is a reinvention of gunboat diplomacy for the 21st century. And we saw Trump supercharge this focus on the Western Hemisphere. Um, First off, just look at his team, right? Rubio is obviously focused on the Western Hemisphere. He announced a special advisor on Latin America immediately. That doesn't happen under most presidential administrations, that they have somebody like tapped immediately. One of my favorite points to just highlight how quickly he focused on the Americas is before the end of December 2024, he had named 10 ambassadors to countries in the Americas, including Canada and the OAS. Like that is quick to be focused on it. Add then to that, the national security strategy is entirely focused, or not entirely focused, but has 4 pages and primarily lists the Western Hemisphere as its primary focus. Rubio's been going around talking about it America's first. We've been hearing a lot about McKinley and the expansion of U.S. power and interventionism in Trump's speeches. Um, and we've seen a lot of this military action. I think that where Venezuela falls into this is actually that Venezuela wasn't the point. Venezuela is an example of what will happen if you don't deal. This is how you prove that you have a big stick and will use it, right? It's not about do we create regime change in Venezuela? Do we create the factors on the ground that we want? It's about you will deal with us or we will use force because we can, and we will create the rationale for it, whether that is to keep China out of quote unquote our backyard, whether that is to prevent narcos, right? The idea that you can just label somebody as a narco terrorist or the head of a foreign terrorist organization to remove them as a police action rather than a military action is a new idea for foreign policy. Definitely not what falls within typical international law, but seems to be where we're going. And the other piece to this is Trump is fascinated by natural resources, right? Look at Greenland. He wants Greenland for rare earths. He's taking stakes in mining companies. The idea of the United States getting a stake in a mining company is mind-blowing to me, particularly for the Republicans. But, I guess the age of small government from the Republicans is over, and we're looking at something different. So I guess my question on that would be, is Venezuela, as it relates to the Trump corollary, even about Venezuela?
Thank you. That's really interesting. And that's, I think, something that a lot of people need to keep in mind as we're moving forward. Was it about Venezuela or was it an example? And we've seen how this administration deals and how they respond to deals going well or deals not going well in their mind. So, yeah, food for thought.
Yeah, it also sets us up really well for the next question that I'll pose to you, Adam. And Gil, I think if you have thoughts on this too, feel free to jump in. This is that controlling and increasing Venezuelan oil production has been articulated prominently as a goal of the U.S. government. Given the reticence that some of the oil companies have expressed to make the investments necessary to support increasing production, what's driving this priority? I know you've spoken to this already a little, that they may have had expected this to be more warmly received, but maybe you can elaborate on that some more.
So this is going to sound a little crazy. I think that some of this also has to do with Trump's other priorities, right? Um, much of Venezuelan oil, not all, but a portion of it was refined in the United States for a long time. And that is part of Trump's idea of bringing back jobs to the United States as well, right? So I think there's a piece of this that's not just about investing in Venezuela in the future, but also domestic jobs. Same thing. I don't think that those jobs are just going to reappear because the refineries that did that work, because Venezuelan oil, and I'm pulling a blank on the exact terminology here, but it's particularly heavy. It's very difficult to process. So a lot of the refineries that were doing that and haven't been able to for 5 years aren't doing that anymore. They converted their processes to refining for liquid natural gas, to refining for different more clean types of gasoline. We'll see if that happens. That being said, I think that in a lot of ways, to paraphrase Obama, I think the 80s called and they want their foreign policy back.
Thank you. We're
Sure.
gonna shift to looking at, oh, I'm so sorry, Gil. Did you have something else to add?
Oh, I mean, I'll just I'll add quickly that one of the things that I think about is what we will kind of retcon as we look back on this episode and say, 10, 15, 20 years, no matter how it turns out. And I do think that the immediate pivot to oil as being the reason for why we did this, when the lead up to it had been some balance of things, but mostly drugs, a little bit about migration, a little bit about power, and a little bit about democracy in Venezuela. But the fact that the immediate justification afterwards was oil. For me, I think what was sort of interesting, in part because I think we will kind of think back and believe that this was a conflict that was fundamentally about oil, or this is an intervention that was fundamentally about oil, and that perhaps the oil companies were the ones who were pushing for us to take Chavez out. When if you've spent any time in the Latin America, DC think tank circuit, that Chevron, for example, was one of the leading voices for easing sanctions, was not necessarily one of the great champions, to say the least, of regime change in Venezuela. If you've spent any time in these circles or some think tanks that have gotten into trouble that I won't necessarily name here. But I do think that will be something that we wind up perhaps misremembering in the past as time passes, is that the oil companies were the ones who were pushing this, when in reality, as Adams pointed out, and as they themselves said, they've actually been one of the ones who are more skeptical about this action, perhaps than other important actors.
Thank you. As I shift into this next section, this has been a very fruitful and nuanced conversation. We do have just about 10 minutes left before we are supposed to shift to Q&A, but we can definitely circle back to any particular topics as time allows. But Adam will give you a break in just a moment. But I want to hear from you when we're thinking about the global response to these events. How have countries in the region, and specifically the multilateral organizations, responded? And what are the implications of this response? Has there been a schism? Has there been a general trend? Anything unexpected?
Sorry, couldn't find the mute button there. Um, so the international response has been mixed, right? And Raul mentioned this earlier, so I just want to kind of tap onto it again real quick, which is there's a difference between how elites have responded, how the population has responded, and how the international organizations have responded. Trump as a whole has made the region, presidents in from the region have to be measured in their responses. Some of that is because there's been a rightward shift across the region that Trump has many more allies in the region than he used to. So you hear some very vocal support for this action from people like Javier Milei in Argentina. Not surprising given his proximity to Trump. And you hear condemnation from people like Lula and Petro, but even their responses have been much more muted than I think you would have heard 10 years ago. And part of that is there's a real concern about what Trump does. At the multilateral level, that's been borne out too, right? The schisms within the region have made it very difficult for multilateral organizations to uniformly condemn this action. So right after right after January 3rd, there was a virtual meeting of the heads of state for CELAC, and they couldn't come away with a joint statement, um, which is a little shocking given that CELAC was designed predominantly to counterbalance U.S. intervention in the region, right? Like you'd think that they would have had something, even if it was a lukewarm, like we recognize, and this is what you hear from a lot of people right now, is like, we recognize everybody's sovereignty. But one place where there's been a really important schism, though, is in CARICOM. CARICOM has been a pretty strong block for supporting each other historically, and more so, I think, than some of the other sub-regional groupings. But even with the boat strikes in the Caribbean, we started to see some schisms where leaders in the region where Caribbean leaders were willing to break from CARICOM and say, no, we're with Trump on this one. And I think that that's something that could have some long-term consequences for some of the sub-regional integration efforts moving forward.
Excellent. This next question is I'll direct to Maria. How has the diaspora in the U.S. Influenced the policy agenda? And what is their connection to mobilization efforts of the democratic opposition in Venezuela?
I have to start by saying that the diaspora here in the US in particular reflects the same differences and dysfunction as the Venezuelan opposition. Not just because you have people who represent the political parties in Venezuela, but also because we have differences. For example, I live in Central Florida, so our diaspora here is less likely to be like the diaspora in Miami, for example, or Houston or New York, where we have, of course, a majority is in South Florida, but let's say that Orlando, Houston, and New York also have a significant number of Venezuelans and Venezuelan Americans. We are a very tiny representation within the Latin American communities and diasporas here. So our engagement with politics in Venezuela is a mixed bag. We have people who, for example, have been supportive of President Trump's first term and this current term and his policy towards Venezuela. And there are groups who oppose, for example, not the removal of Maduro, which is part of our complexities. No one opposes the extraction, removal of Maduro. The problem is where we are at right now. And I don't think it's a surprise or revealing that there is not a lot of communication between our diaspora, broadly speaking, and the leadership, the political leadership. There was communication during the Biden years with certain groups of Venezuelan Americans here. I understand that during the first Trump administration, those groups did not have communication with the president back then. And now it's obvious that he is not even engaging with Machado in a way that we would expect, given that she was elected as the primary, in a primary, as the candidate. So she has the legitimacy to represent Venezuelans in Venezuela and abroad, and yet she has been sidelined by this administration. So it's very difficult for Venezuelans here to have any, I wouldn't say influence. I don't think there is any way for them beyond what we see with Machado and her political party, which is not the complete platform that we see in Venezuela, with all the differences, with all the divergence. At least there's a platform in Venezuela. We don't have that here in the US. So the diaspora, this current version of it, does not really have much leverage, if it had any at some point.
Thank you, Maria. we're going to think about now, let's talk about what's next for Venezuela. And this next question I would like to direct toward Raul. So, what do you think some of the hurdles faced by the opposition are on the road to democratic transition? And do you think there is a scenario where the Chavistas just retain power indefinitely?
That is a very good question, Emma. We would call that in Venezuela la pregunta de las mil lochas, which would roughly translate to what? To the $1 million question. And it's essentially the issue is, on one hand, um, first of all, there is a lot of uncertainty and a lot of information that we don't have in hand to know exactly how this is going to play out. So any scenario that we map has a high degree of uncertainty. We just don't know. Come back to the beginning of the conversation. Now, in terms of scenarios, it depends on one hand on this is an interplay that is not anymore mainly about the opposition and the government. The response to this question also passes by the variable of the United States as a major presence and how it ultimately is involved in Venezuela facing forward. That is a variable that is new in the analysis of regime politics in Venezuela to the extent that we are analyzing it now. So that's an important point to consider as well. Now, looking at the opposition itself, the opposition is a fragmented bunch. We can't talk about a unified opposition. That is the first point. The regime knows this. The United States also knows this. The opposition itself knows this. So a big part of the problem is whether and to what degree we will see cooperation emerging, not only as a result of structural factors, but also as a will, as is actually something that actors indeed want or wish. And that will be in on itself a function of how things unfold in the coming months and let's say year or two. We don't know exactly when, for example, an election will take place. That's another important variable to consider. And we all know as well, of course, the biggest opposition figure, Maria Corina Machado, has, of course, her own prominence, his own group, her own agenda. But within Venezuela, there are many other opposition actors as well that need to be reckoned with. So it is a story of agency. It is a story of coordination, as Marisabel has pointed out. It is a story as well of factors that we don't know yet. And ultimately, it's a story of whether there will be institutionally an opportunity for a moderately, minimally free and fair election for the opposition to be able to take power in the event that they can actually capitalize on the support that they have on the ground. But that also takes me to the other side of the equation, because of course los rusos también juegan, or in this case los chavistas también juegan. And what is Delcy Rodriguez's bet? Well, there are two bets there. Well, the main bet is consolidating her rule. And whether consolidating her rule passes by further consolidating or mutating the authoritarian regime that she presides, scenario one, in a sort of a format that minimizes the role of democratic politics or embraces democratic politics selectively to the extent that favors her permanence in power, which is also a possibility, remains a question mark. Well, right now we just say, well, if there was an election today, for sure, Chavismo will lose. I mean, I don't have, I don't think anyone could predict that in a moderately free and fair election there would be another result, no? Provided there's certain caveats in mind. But in 2 years down the road, say, for example, that the economy has stabilized, say, for example, that there is a deliberate, narrative over the course of time that the problem from the Chavista side was Maduro. And Maduro was the problem all along. Said also, this is a big if. As we know, Delcy Rodriguez has problems of her own. There are people who are discontent within Chavismo. So she has also a big, and that's not easy. You've been calling the United States the devil and the hegemon that needs to be challenged for 20, 25 years. And now you're going to be doing deals with them, while, of course, President Maduro is captured. I mean, there is a cognitive dissonance there that I don't know for how long and to what effect it can last. But certainly what we're going to see is the Rodriguez group, and particularly Delcy, trying to stay in power, trying to consolidate her rule, and if betting on democratic politics, trying perhaps to continue in power by way of an election that is crafted in such a way that capitalizes on a possibly improved um, portion of the population. So that's more or less the terms of how I see the situation unfolding. That results on scenarios. The couple of things that I want to say very quickly about that. Well, one, of course, depends, of course, on when the election takes place. We're talking about scenarios that range from democratization in the country in the longer run and the likelihood of either the government still keeping power, as astounding as that sounds now, or the opposition, for example, arriving, and there are different actors who bet on this. But I want to call attention to a big variable here that we haven't really spoken about. In addition to the prospects of democracy, that's directly tied, as I mentioned, to the prospects of the reconstruction of the Venezuelan state and of state capacity and of rule of law and of the capacity of Venezuela to develop a sustainable economy. And that's a key variable there. And as I was listening to you, I was sketching kind of a simple typology where you go 4 different scenarios. One kind of pretty bad where we already are, where we don't have democracy and we have a very diminished state, and we have Maduro. Boom, that goes. Then we have 3 others. It could be that we have a state that improves its capacity, but is still autocratic, possibly with DLC in power, but still someone else could from the Chavista regime. And then we have the 2 others, the happier story of democracy prospering, but with democracy prospering still one where Chavismo is strong and is strong enough with a state that is recovered and actually keeping power. Or, for example, one where democracy is still as a solution, but the state is still lagging in capacity. And in that situation, the democratic regime in question might have problems, again, to consolidate its rule, and we more likely than not see quite a bit of instability simply because of the lack of ability also to capitalize on its own commitments and so forth. So that's more or less the scenarios that I see.
If I could just add one scenario to that, which is possibly worse, which is the Chavistas can't improve state capacity. The US is saying they're running it and can't improve state capacity, and it all collapses. Because you're right, rule of law and state capacity are critical here.
Yeah, absolutely, Adam. I mean, there were a number of scenarios that I call the doom spiral, and it's kind of the cascading bottoms of the barrel situation, which honestly, as a Venezuelan, I try to keep not engaging too much with, but of course, it exists, and we need to be mindful of it.
Well, on that note, I have another question for Raul that may touch here. One of the greatest risks in navigating a transition from authoritarianism to a more open society is that the already present criminal elements disrupt or even co-opt a new government. What kind of policy options do you see for managing the activities of armed criminal groups?
There are 2 questions. There are 2 possible answers to this question. One, for example, is to answer it try to answer it from a more normative perspective of democratic reconstruction, in which we aspire the regime to be as free and devoid as time passes by, particularly if we're betting on the democratization, on the country's democratization from criminal elements across the different levels of interaction of the state and society. And that's exactly what I hope for Venezuela. And in my best scenario that I hope, that's what I think. On the other hand, a conversation that I was having before this meeting with a colleague who is a lawyer in Venezuela, we're talking about how in Venezuela we often, as happens in many other countries, when lawyers we talk about the law, we tend to, unfortunately, divorce it from actually how the situation and the application of the law works on the ground. And with this, I mean that unfortunately, criminal groups are part of Venezuelan socioeconomic fabric at the moment. So we're talking about negotiations of different kinds happening in different spheres for the purposes of stabilization, but also for the purposes of state rebuilding in the longer run. And we don't know yet what kind of equilibriums will emerge from that story. So, I would love to say, well, big part of the state rebuilding in Venezuela and rebuilding Venezuela is getting rid of all these different groups. The reality is a lot more complicated. It's a lot more fine grained and involves then looking at each particular domain of society that we're talking about. Are we talking about, for example, all the way from security in the streets to different kinds of businesses and so forth? It is a very complex story, and one that I also hope the conversation was actually more difficult but needed, of acknowledging that yes, it is a big part of the story, and we need to look at what kind of equilibriums are possible in the short run, and also down the road. Again, this applies not only to one sector but to many.
Thank you. Now I know we're a little over time, but we're going to switch it over to some Q&A that we've received from the audience. The first one I'm going to direct is actually directed to you, Gil. So they asked, Gil mentioned that it is easy for Venezuela to discount foreign opposition if it has been out of the country for 10 to 15 years. Yet this was the exact case with Iran and the Ayatollah in 1979, and look how that turned out for the dispersal of global power. That being said, are there rules about foreign opposition that should be region or nation specific?
Yes, that's a great question to Brandon McGowan who asked it. And this is something that I think you can kind of pick examples kind of for and against this. So you could also think, for example, not to get too comparative political science here, but I think that one of the main differentiating factors of whether or not that opposition movements is discredited or not is whether the regime at home has sort of a stake and a credibility with being actually kind of a legitimate authentic nationalist movement. So to use Ireland perhaps as an example, obviously that's a country that has been throughout history, throughout its recent history, very much influenced by its diaspora. Why was the Irish diaspora not necessarily discredited during the early 1900s when it tried to, in many cases, have leaders come back and take part in revolutionary activities? Well, part of it was because the power in Ireland at the time was the British, who were seen obviously as being not local to that force in that area. I think the same thing applies with Iran, with the Shah, for example, as being studied as being too Western, too sort of non-Iranian in that sense. The reason why I say that the regime has been able to paint opposition figures like this, and why Cuba takes this route, Nicaragua takes this approach, all the regimes in Latin America take this approach, because the dividing line is not necessarily so much that their weakness among their own publics is that they are not kind of local or authentic or kind of a homegrown movement. You see a lot of nationalist posturing among all three. Obviously, you can talk a little bit, or you can see that in the question of the Essequibo in Venezuela and some of the recent movements towards that much more complicated issue. Perhaps, obviously, even the opposition has some beliefs about the Essequibo and who it belongs to. As if you talk to them, they will gladly tell you. But I do think that it works in this regional context because the question is not so much are the regimes in places like Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua kind of authentically Venezuelan, Cuban, and Nicaraguan. It's more of a question of what competing vision do you actually have for the country, what kind of ideological divides there are. I think that's why I'm not saying that this tactic is actually something that has worked. Obviously, the opposition still won a majority in the last legitimate election in Venezuela, but it is something that the regimes in the region try to do, whether it's successful or unsuccessful. It's certainly something that they try to capitalize on, but as we've seen, it's not something that always is successful or always lands, especially because oftentimes those critiques may or may not actually have substance behind them.
Thank you, Gil.
Yes. I think for the next question, I'll ask this first to Maria and add that if other panelists want to jump in after, they're welcome to. What is the meaning of all this for Cuba? How come the defenses of Maduro by the Russians and Cubans did not work against an American attack? Obviously, Venezuela and Cuba have had a very close special relationship over the Chavista years, and something is going to change. What are your thoughts?
I think the fact that the military could not respond or decided not to respond. We don't know that. There's a lot of speculation about that. If it was intentional, or was it that all the junk that they've bought from the Russian Federation is, well, it's junk. So we don't really know what this could mean for the long term. But in the short term, there seems to be a strained relationship between Rodriguez and the Diaz-Canel regime. Apparently, there's some the Rodriguez, because we can't leave her brother out of this. They feel like Cuba has been taking advantage of Venezuela for too long, and that this episode in particular gives them some cover for, you know, you were very inefficient, you didn't protect Maduro, and so on. We know that's not exactly the case, but apparently it has to do with oil, sending oil to Cuba in the conditions it's being sent. It's not something that Venezuela wants to continue, at least not at this point. So I don't know if that's totally accurate. But what we know is that among the conditions the Trump administration has publicly addressed is cutting ties with Cuba, China, and Russia, which is interesting. So my guess is, and today, again, there were some reports about Rodriguez taking distance from the Trump administration, but again, she is doubling down on the great communication channels she's having with President Trump. So my guess is that probably Cuba is not going to continue having these type of subsidies. Oil has been interrupted for quite some time. I think when the boat strikes started. So I don't think that's going to change in the short term. We don't know if things really get under control in Venezuela, that's going to change. But so far, my reading of the situation is that that's one of the first chips to fall. In this case, Cuba is on the losing end.
If I could just add two things really quickly on this. It was interesting to me that the Russian ambassador to Venezuela came out recently and said that the Venezuelans fired two Igla missiles and apparently missed both, and really tried to blame sort of the lack of expertise and lack of skill on the Venezuelan part, because obviously Russia's prestige has taken a bit of a hit with its equipment, and so there's certainly an attempt by Russia to kind of pin the blame on the Venezuelans for this, but it does seem that that was something that occurred. And secondly, I think that I alluded to this in a previous remark, but it seems to me, from what we can tell by the public comments and also some of the policy requests that have been made by the Trump administration to say divert oil from Cuba, it seems to me that the plan sort of following this is perhaps to make conditions in Cuba so dire that people in Cuba will rise up and overthrow the Diaz-Canel government. And from everything that I've heard from people I know who have worked in Cuba recently and who know and are in contact with people in Cuba right now, conditions there are so abysmal that it seems very difficult for me for that to actually come about, because people are in such dire conditions that, you know, they have just over the years not been able to actually see any results from their protests, for one, and also two, if you're already kind of on death's door almost, you're not going to be going out there and starting some sort of revolution. It's obviously a much smaller country, etc. You know, to be very clear, I was supportive of this operation. I'm supportive of regime change in Cuba, but I think that particular strategy seems to me to be something that is just out of touch with the actual facts on the ground of how things could potentially transpire.
Thank you both. I'm going to move on to Helena's question. So, Adam, this might be a good one for you, but again, anyone else jump in if they would like. What do you think are the pros and cons of the I don't know. Is my video still going? It's slow on my end. It is? Okay, great. Sorry, my Wi-Fi in my building can be spotty. So, Adam, what do you think are the pros and cons of the Monroe Doctrine? Do you think that it can be an effective Monroe Doctrine of the 21st century? Why or why not?
Sorry, I'm muted there. Excellent question, Helena. I think the first question is was the Monroe Doctrine originally effective? And I would argue in some ways no, because it's become a bad word in the region. Um, but I'm going to start with what are the pros of the Monroe Doctrine? One, I think, is they're at least paying attention. I think that that is a first step, is that Latin America and the Caribbean have asked for attention for a long time, and the United States has ignored it. Our attention has been elsewhere, and I think there being attention can be a good thing. I don't think the approach itself, though, is the way to do that. Um, Part of this comes to the question of what is your goal, right? And I think this is where at the beginning we were asked, is this a good strategy or not? This is going to help the United States position in the region or not? And I think short term, yeah, this is effective, and that the Trump administration can leverage the its use of force in the region to pursue its interests. And at the moment, it has allies in the region that are willing to work with it. Long term, though, U.S. overreach in the region, as Gil has mentioned with the Guatemala in 1954 example, results in backlash. And we are going to see that happen again. So right now, public perception is that it's a great thing that, Maduro's gone in almost every country in the region. But when asked who should run the country, the answer is not the United States, it's the opposition, almost without fail. There's like one or two countries in the study in the surveys that actually say it should still be the Chavistas, but I think that has more to do with like sticking it to the United States than actually thinking the Chavistas should stay in power. Um, I don't think this is a long-term strategy that's going to work. I think it's going to create blowback, and in the long term, we're going to see other countries come to power. Gil also mentioned the example of Canada. Trump overplays his hand. An ally of his was going to get elected. Now he has one of his harshest critics on the international stage is Canada. Um, and that's an important step. And I think you're going to see the same thing happening country after country. If the United States wants to have an effective, and I'm not going to call it a Monroe Doctrine, an effective good neighbor policy for the 21st century, that means engaging with the region in a meaningful way to develop partnerships, not just with the leaders that we like, which is what the national security strategy calls for, is this idea of we're going to enlist champions and then expand them to everybody who wants to be a champion with us. But to countries that disagree with us too, we have to find ways to work with them, so that in the long term, the populations of countries can work with the population of the United States as well.
Yeah, I really like that answer. And it speaks to my experience where I've going to school, people would always say, this is going to be like every presidential administration says Latin America is going to be the focus now. And well, for once, I am not justifying why I study Latin America to my colleagues. I want to focus or just ask one more question as we close up here, and that is Ramon's. I'll direct this to Raul. Is there a possible scenario where there could be a partial political liberalization like the PRI rule in Mexico? Or if you could speak to some of the scenarios that are possible coming out of this.
Thank you, Robert. And please, colleagues, feel free to jump in as well. Again, in these different scenarios that we mapped, further autocratic stabilization and consolidation, further transition to democracy, then that's the other extreme, right? Right, there is a whole range of scenarios that we need to consider in terms of A, type of regime, and B, stability, and C, what kind of elements of those regimes would actually be democratic or authoritarian. And I think that's very important. And in the case of the possibility, for example, of an autocratic regime with democratic features, that was to some degree Chavismo's preferred regime type for a little while, a hybrid authoritarian regime that was competitive authoritarian and at the same time would allow Chavismo to secure power while at the same time retain a modicum of democratic features that had a range of benefits both internally and externally. And I wouldn't be surprised if not only, probably even Delcy herself, but some Chavista leaders might actually still aspire to that kind of regime and imagine that that's actually feasible, provided certain conditions are in place, as I was explaining in the previous reply. So, is that something that I see as a possibility? Well, not necessarily as a possibility yet, but certainly as an aspiration. I can see that from some angles, and then a non-trivial likelihood that that could be the case. But again, there are so many variables at play here that I wouldn't be able to actually bet on any of them with certainty. I want, by the way, to call attention, and I don't know if other people can actually see other questions in the Q&A, but Pablo Hernandez Borges, for example, Matt Nicely, cited, quoted Meyert's 2023 analysis of possible different regime type scenarios, and that's actually for those of you who want to start a really good, as they call it here, pop conversation is well, that's something that you can say. Hey, look at the different scenarios here. Which one do you think will actually eventuate in the case of Venezuela, and why? Certainly makes for a really good question for an undergrad or postgrad class or any other kind of conversation about the Venezuelan regime at the moment.
Thank you so much. I think we are at about time. I want to thank the panelists and our audience for being here. And Rob, if you want to say anything as well.
No, I would just also add my thanks. I think we've had a wonderful conversation with our panelists and learned a lot from this. And I'm really grateful for their time being here this evening.
This has been excellent.
Very grateful for the opportunity. This has been fantastic. Thank you so much to the organizers and my colleagues.
Thank you. It was a great conversation, and thank you guys for organizing this, Emma, Adam, and Robert. And it was great to be with Raul and Gil. Thank you very much.
Thanks to all of you for organizing and for being on here. Enjoyed it immensely. Great honor to be among such intelligent and distinguished scholars.
And I just want to give a quick shout out. I know, Gil, you're on YPFP leadership, but thank you to the YPF leadership for hosting this event. What's happening in Venezuela and in Latin America and the Caribbean more broadly is often not discussed enough. So we're thrilled to be partnering with you guys on these types of events.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Bye. Thank you.